World War I, also known as the Great War, began in 1914 after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His murder catapulted into a war across Europe that lasted until 1918. During the conflict, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States. Thanks to new military technologies and the horrors of trench warfare, World War I saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. By the time the war was over and the Allied powers claimed victory, more than 16 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were dead. This video covers America and its involvement in World War I. By the 20th century, a more confident United States was willing to take on the role of policeman of the Western Hemisphere. In the early 1900s, Roosevelt grew concerned that a crisis between Venezuela and its creditors could spark an invasion of that nation by European powers. The Roosevelt Corollary of December 1904 stated that the United States would intervene as a last resort to ensure that other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors and did not violate the rights of the U.S. Throughout the early 20th century, the U.S. increasingly used military force to restore internal stability to many nations in the region. Roosevelt declared that the U.S. might exercise international police power in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence. Over the long term, the Roosevelt Corollary had little to do with relations between the Western Hemisphere and Europe, but it did serve as justification for U.S. intervention in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The British had rights over control of a canal through Nicaragua. Because of the Boer War and wanting friendly relations with the U.S., they signed over rights to the canal to the U.S. Many U.S. experts favored a route over Nicaragua, but there was a French company that failed in its effort to build a canal across Panama that wanted to salvage something from its venture. They dropped the price of their rights to the canal from $109 million to $40 million. U.S. Congress agreed to a Panamanian route which shifted debate to the country Colombia. The U.S. and Colombia came up with an agreement, but it was rejected by the Colombian Senate. President Roosevelt grew tired of the Colombian government's refusal to agree to the U.S. terms for digging across the Isthmus of Panama. Roosevelt supported a Panamanian revolt in 1903. He sent down U.S. gunboats to ensure that the Colombians did not invade Panama after they revolted. The newly independent Panama signed the Hay-Buenaventura Treaty in 1903, which gave the U.S. long-term control of a canal zone in Panama. The canal was completed in 1914 and cost the U.S. $500 million. It formally opened on August 15, 1914. Theodore Roosevelt's gunboat diplomacy, or big stick diplomacy, was the use of the Navy to control a region or country. Roosevelt would use this policy in Latin America to keep European powers out of the region. Here are some examples. In Cuba, the U.S. and Cuba signed a treaty granting the U.S. the right to lease the area of Guantanamo Bay for coaling and naval stations. In 1906, there will be political unrest, and Teddy Roosevelt will send the U.S. Marines to occupy Cuba for 3 years. In the Dominican Republic, in 1905, the U.S. took over the management of tariff collections, an arrangement formalized in a treaty with the Dominicans 2 years later. While it caused a lot of resentment, it was a success from the debt collecting point of view. In the Philippines, of course, there was the Filipino-American War lasting from 1901 to 1903. We already talked about the Panama Canal, and we also discussed Santo Domingo in 1904. This map shows Europe in 1914, before the outbreak of World War I. As you can see, there are two main alliances that will eventually become the two sides of the war. Military alliance systems were developed to maintain a balance of power between rival nations in Europe. The alliance systems were the result of a major war between France and Germany in 1871, in which Germany severely defeated France in less than 6 weeks. Germany took the resource-rich area of Alsace-Lorraine away from France and placed a huge war reparation bill on them, threatening to occupy France until the debt was paid. The alliance systems were defensive systems in which each member promised to come to the aid of the others if they were attacked. While the Germans feared the French would seek revenge through a future attack, France was determined to form an alliance in which Germany could be encircled. Italy saw a chance to increase its African land holdings, and England saw an opportunity to check the growing power of the German Navy. The two main alliances were the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain. Here are the main causes of World War I. M stands for militarism. Most major European powers had been amassing large armies or navies since the mid-1800s in order to protect their Asian, Middle Eastern, and African empires. By the end of the 1800s, a nation's army or navy was seen as a source of national pride. Germany and Italy united their countries through small-scale victorious wars and equipped well-trained and well-equipped militaries. Many new weapons had been developed by the early 1900s: tanks, planes, submarines, chemical weapons, biological weapons, flamethrowers, machine guns, heavy artillery, and conscription. The Russian army was the largest with 8 million men. The German army was the best trained and equipped. England had the largest navy, but the German navy had submarines. A stands for an alliance system. I discussed that in the previous slide. I stands for imperialism. The late 1800s produced a tremendous competition among European nations to acquire resources for continued wealth, markets, industrialization, and military power. While France and Germany came into conflict in Morocco over trading rights, which almost resulted in a war in 1905 between the two nations, Germany and Russia found themselves in conflict with the Ottoman Empire. Russia desperately wanted to establish a warm water port in the Mediterranean Sea. Germany wanted to build a railroad that would connect Baghdad in Iraq to Berlin, Germany. A railroad would allow them to ship their goods from Asia through the Persian Gulf and then by rail instead of relying on English-controlled Suez Canal. Finally, N stands for nationalism. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was an empire in decline by 1914. Its emperor, Franz Joseph, was well into his 80s and had given up some power in 1867 when Austria and Hungary created a dual monarchy, allowing some self-rule to Hungarians. Military allegiance and duty was still under the control of the Austrian emperor. In 1914, the Austro-Hungarian Empire experienced strains in the southern part of its country, the Balkans. Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Montenegro, all Slavic peoples were being enticed by fellow Slavic nation Serbia to break away from Austria and become part of a new greater Serbia. Russia was in full support of such a move, being the largest Slavic nation in Europe, since it saw an opportunity to get a warm water port if such an event ever happened. Russia promised Serbian military aid if they needed to achieve such a goal. It was all part of what Russia called a movement for a pan-Slavism, a movement to unite all Slavic people. There had been 2 previous wars fought in the Balkans since 1910, which saw Serbia increase in size. Into this picture entered Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who had been sent by his uncle, Emperor Franz Joseph, to travel to Sarajevo to inspect the troops and size things up. While he was there, he was going to offer the idea of a tri-monarchy, which would allow the Bosnians some self-rule. Serbian terrorist organizations like the Black Hand had been operating in Bosnia, putting out propaganda, agitating for the Bosnians to break away and join Serbia. Most were teenage boys. Gavrilo Princip was one such teenager, along with 4 others who had planned to assassinate the Archduke on his visit. When opportunity presented itself after his friend had failed, Princip shot point blank at the Austrian Archduke, hitting him in the back, and attempted to kill the governor riding in the Archduke's car, but missed and killed the Archduke's wife, Sophie, instead. It happened in Sarajevo, Bosnia, on June 28, 1914. The conspirators were caught and tried and sent to jail. Austria sent an ultimatum to Serbia, demanding the conspirators be tried by Austrian officials. Germany supported the ultimatum. Serbia had 1 month to respond. It did not respond until it talked to Russia, who did not respond until it talked to France. The Russians saw the ultimatum as one that violated Serbian sovereignty, and therefore was just an effort to provoke Serbia into war, a war that Serbia could not win. Russia mobilized its forces along the Austrian border. Austria did not wait for the first shot and began bombing Belgrade on July 28, 1914. Germany did not wait for Russian forces to invade its frontier and declared war on France. So it goes something like this. Serbia and Russia declared war on Austria. Germany declared war on Russia, invaded Belgium, and declared war on France. England declared war on Germany. What emerged were 2 alliance systems. Should the U.S. remain neutral? That means we would not take a side. At first, Americans did not want to join in the war. We had no stake in it. We didn't want to risk American lives or property. Many recent immigrants rooted for their former countries, but it was the economy that ultimately helped push us in one direction over the other. This idea of neutrality came from our first president, George Washington, whose farewell address warned that alliances could drag us into war. Wilson used this idea in his 1916 re-election campaign using the slogan, "He kept us out of war." For the purpose of this class, what's more important are the causes of U.S. entry into World War I. Let's start first with economic involvement. The U.S. allowed banks and private companies to give loans for war goods and munitions to England, France, and Germany. In order to maintain its neutrality, the U.S. had to trade with both sides, though not equally. Munitions makers had earned the name merchants of death by the end of the war. The problem for the United States was that German culture, science, literature, art, music, and philosophy was beginning to replace France as the cultural leader of Europe. There were many German Americans in the U.S. that still had ties to the fatherland, and many in American society had started looking at Germany as the leader of Europe. The Irish in the United States did not support England, who at this time was also engaged in a war with Ireland over land rights and religion. The U.S. government also sold war bonds, mainly to Americans, but also to England and France. In all, the Allies received $10.5 billion in loans, money the U.S. would want paid back as soon as the war was over. The next was propaganda. Propaganda is a war of words to capture the support of the people behind one unified front. In May of 1915, England issued the Bryce Report, which claimed that Germans had committed gross atrocities as they invaded Belgium. Germans had supposedly raped nuns and young children, destroyed churches and museums, burned books as stolen pieces of art. They supposedly dropped poison candy from airplanes for French children to eat. They cut off the arms and legs of French children, gouged out the eyes of men with hot iron spikes, and cut off the tongues of Americans in France. Americans read these stories and were horrified. The leaders of Europe were now the Huns of old. None of these stories were verified. The biggest lie of all was that Germans were removing dead bodies from the battlefield and turning them into grease, soap, and fertilizer. A London editor took a picture sent of him to Germans removing dead soldiers from the field and embellished on the story. One of the new elements of war in World War I was the use of submarines. Germany had employed a submarine net around the British Isles while England chose to blockade the German coast on the North Sea, each hoping to starve the other out. Submarine warfare was a problem. No longer would ships be warned of a pending attack, nor would survivors be picked up as in the past. This would be naval warfare with no restrictions, no rules of engagement that had existed before. For the U.S., this was a problem since American merchant ships were being sunk, destroying American property and taking lives. All this while the U.S. was a neutral nation. In May of 1915, the Lusitania, a British passenger ship, was sunk by a German U-boat. It was the fastest ship afloat and was to be converted to a warship upon its return to England. The Germans suspected it was carrying munitions on board, using innocent civilians to protect the weapons shipment. A series of explosions aboard the Lusitania led to speculation that the ship was carrying weapons, later verified by Winston Churchill. 128 Americans died on the Lusitania, which brought a sharp response from President Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916 on the platform of continued progressive reform and neutrality during World War I. One of his slogans was, "He kept us out of war." He used a front porch campaign, with several supporters traveling the country on his behalf, giving speeches and handing out pamphlets. Wilson won the election narrowly, 277 to 254, over Charles Evans Hughes, who favored women's suffrage and involvement in World War I, which the public opposed. In January 1917, England had intercepted a telegram from the German minister Arthur Zimmermann, requesting that Mexico go to war with the U.S. in return for the lands they lost to the U.S. in the Mexican-American War in 1846. England withheld this information until February, hoping that it would provide the needed push to get the U.S. to come to its aid. The effect of the telegram frightened people in the Southwest, and they gave great support to Wilson in his decision to take the nation to war. On the East Coast, Americans feared an attack by German U-boats. The man who had kept the nation out of war in the presidential election of 1916 now had a clear path to take the nation to war in April 1917.
The fifth cause was the Russian Revolution. The oppressive Russian czars, the Romanovs, were overthrown and replaced with a representative government. Now American hawks could claim that the war was a war of democracies versus brutal monarchies. Unfortunately, the representative government in Russia would be overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who quickly signed a treaty with Germany to exit the war. Russia became known as the Soviet Union, the first communist state.
Alvin York from rural Tennessee claimed to be a conscientious objector after being drafted into the Army during World War I. He claimed that his religion prevented him from being a soldier. He eventually was persuaded to join the Army and was sent to France. During an attack on a German machine gun nest during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he took one gun, killed 25 enemy soldiers, and captured 132. He earned the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroics in the battle that led to the armistice. General John Pershing commanded the American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, during World War I. As commander, Pershing was responsible for the organization, training, and supply of a professional army. The AEF grew from 27,000 inexperienced men to 3 armies totaling over 2 million soldiers combined. African American units were not allowed to participate with the AEF, but fought under separate units, some of which fought under French command. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, or the Battle of Argonne Forest, was the largest battle in U.S. military history, involving 1.2 million soldiers. It was a 3-phase offensive, fought over 47 days, and led to the end of the war. Over 350,000 soldiers died in this battle, partly due to the onset of the Spanish flu pandemic, which contributed to the death toll. Despite poor tactics, the AEF pushed the Germans back into Germany and forced them to sue for peace. In 1917, driven by the success of the German U-boat submarines and their attacks on Allied and neutral ships at sea, the British Royal Navy introduces a newly created convoy system, whereby all merchant ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean would travel in groups under the protection of the British Navy. Under this system, a convoy of 10 to 50 ships might be escorted by a cruiser, 6 destroyers, 11 armed ships, and a pair of torpedo boats with aerial scouting equipment to detect the movement of submarines. Convoy gathering points were established along the Atlantic coast from Canada to Brazil to handle the transport not only of men and arms, but also of foodstuffs and horses, the basic supplies of the Allied war effort. The convoy system marked the beginning of a decline in the damage caused by U-boats. Between May 1917 and November 1918, a total of 1.1 million American troops were transported across the Atlantic in a convoy, and only 637 of them were drowned as a result of German attacks.